Sometimes something becomes so popular and successful it becomes the poster child for an entire company or even genre. Perhaps nothing embodies the spirit of the horror genre more than the Friday the 13th franchise and its iconic and legendary villain Jason Voorhees. This franchise that was started over 40 years ago has spawned 10 canonical films, a crossover film with the equally treacherous Freddy Krueger, a remake, and various other forms of entertainment and media. While not very popular with critics, audiences flock to theaters with every new release, making it the second highest grossing horror franchise of all time. With a franchise as wildly successful as Friday the 13th, and as I am a huge fan, it's exciting for me to do this video in which I'm going to rank each movie from what I think is the worst to the best. Before we begin getting into the illustrious murdering rampage of this beloved hockey mask wearing killer, I do want to bring up a couple of things. This video is based completely on opinion, and is no way intended to be any kind of official list or ranking. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, and it is not only possible, but likely, that you may disagree with some or even all of my picks. This is totally acceptable, and I encourage you to voice your thoughts in the comments below. Just please remember to keep it respectful. Another thing I wanted to say is that I'm going to assume that everyone watching this video has seen most, if not all, of these movies. And as such, these are not going to be in-depth reviews of each film. There are a lot of movies to cover, so for the sake of time, these will be brief plot overviews and general opinions of each film. The very last thing I want to say before we get started is that this ranking will only include 10 of the 12 films, as it will not include Freddy vs. Jason or the 2009 remake. So this list will only consist of the original film from 1980 and continue all the way up until Jason X in 2001. Now that we got that out of the way, let's get started. The Jason movie that starts us off at the bottom of this list is Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. The 9th movie of this franchise, it was released in 1993 and is by far the worst film in the series and just generally an all-around bad horror film. About the spirit of Jason Voorhees possessing others and continuing his killing spree, he also searches for a member of his bloodline in order to resurrect himself. Easily the biggest problem this movie has is the exclusion of Jason in physical character, as he uses his spirit to make other people kill. To include this supernatural element and almost altogether remove Jason himself from the movie was a really questionable decision. Also, the addition of giving Jason relatives is something I found odd, as Jason is almost always seen as an isolated monster and his only connections is to Camp Crystal Lake and his mother. While this can be considered bold by some, for me it didn't work, and I ended up not enjoying this film at all. I have only seen Jason Goes to Hell a handful of times, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I probably never will again. I can't believe I am saying this, but just slightly better than Jason Goes to Hell is Jason X. Being released in 2001, this was the first Friday the 13th film that I was old enough to go and see in theaters. Jason X can also simply be called Jason in Space, because well, Jason ends up in space. And that's pretty much the plot of this movie. The writing is awful, and the numerous one-liners were immature and at times idiotic.
Guys, it's okay. He just wanted his machete back. Whew.
It's gonna take more than a poke in the ribs to put down this old dog. Yeah, that ought to do it.
The sets were terrible, there was absolutely no tension, the characters were weak, and even Uber Jason wasn't scary. This film doesn't even really feel like a Jason movie. Most of the time, actually, it rather reminds one of a second-rate Star Trek ripoff. One thing I constantly hear the defenders of this movie say is, wait, what about the liquid nitrogen death scene? I'll go ahead and address this right now. It's awesome. There, it's addressed. But just because this movie has one cool death doesn't take away from the fact that Jason X still sucks. This film is almost laughably bad. And even if it was, that's not good for a Jason film. This next film also takes Jason into unfamiliar territory, and that is Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Once again being resurrected by a freak act of nature, Jason finds himself aboard a cruise ship with an abundance of typical teenage sitting ducks which Jason effortlessly kills. Amidst the murder and mayhem, the chaos leads them to the city that never sleeps, which doesn't seem to bother Jason one bit as he continues his rampage in the filthy city streets. Very much like the previous two films mentioned, most of this movie is wrapped in bad writing, uninspired characters, and a lazy plot. However, unlike the aforementioned films, the part where Jason actually gets to and is in Manhattan is actually quite enjoyable. Unlike in Space, placing an unstoppable killing machine in the most crowded city on Earth worked pretty well, as watching Jason terrorize local thugs and tear through restaurants was something new to the franchise. Jason Takes Manhattan is almost like a tale of two films, with the beginning being rather tired and boring, but the ending pretty cool and fun. If this entire film were to have taken place in Manhattan, I feel like it would have been rather enjoyable and maybe higher on this list. These next three movies all exist in what I call Friday the 13th Purgatory, as none of them are bad enough to doom them to an eternity in movie damnation, but also aren't good enough to enjoy film paradise. The first of these is Friday the 13th: A New Beginning, the fifth movie released in the series. The first in the franchise after it was declared over and done with since the release of Part 4, the final chapter. It seems that the suits in the studios weren't quite finished with picking the pockets of audiences who were still eager to shell out cash for another opportunity to see Jason kill again. Only problem is that in this movie, it wasn't the undead deformed monster from the previous several films, it was a Jason imposter. While this may make sense in some sort of overall story narrative, to me it was extremely underhanded and conned many people with a bait and switch. This is by far the biggest problem I have with this film, as everything else really wasn't that bad. I mean, the characters were likable, albeit shallow, but that's expected. And there were some pretty decent kills, and this movie actually maintained good tension as well. Everything up until the disastrous reveal at the end would actually put A New Beginning a little higher on this list. However, the massive cop-out at the end winds up being pretty unforgivable as it shows the true colors of the suits just out to steal your dollar. At the number 6 spot and only barely better than A New Beginning is Friday the 13th Part 2. Quickly released after the original movie, it set out to immediately capitalize on the success of the first film. A new addition and mainstay of the franchise, Jason Voorhees was introduced as a masked killer hell-bent on avenging his mother's death. And his influence has been of no small importance in the decades since, and will no doubt continue into the foreseeable future of horror films, particularly slashers. And while Jason Voorhees' impact on film culture is vast and wide, his first presentation could have been better. The direction they initially chose to go in for this eventual mass murder legend was that of a backwards hillbilly who lived in a shack and ate roadkill. He also wore a burlap sack as his mask. On a laziness scale from 1 to 10, that hits about a 0.5. This is my least favorite Jason of the entire franchise, although it is easy to see that this film is early in the series, and as such is before his character became the undead powerful killing machine we all know today. But something about a pissed off redneck wearing a sack just doesn't work that well for me. The rest of the film as well is pretty average and formulaic, with generic characters and worse story arcs, but there are a couple of cool kills in this film, and one actually stands out as one of the better ones in the entire franchise. Part 2 is only marginally better than A New Beginning, mostly due to the fact that at least this film actually has Jason, albeit a redneck version, but it is still better than a Jason impersonator. The next movie on this list is Friday the 13th Part 3, which is in my opinion noticeably better than any previous film mentioned on this list. This movie is known as the one where Jason gets his iconic hockey mask, which is probably the most recognizable thing to exist in horror, and perhaps even go beyond the genre itself. Aside from the introduction of the mask, however, the film itself is actually quite entertaining. The characters, although not entirely unique or possess a good amount of depth, actually become quite likable, which makes the kills that Jason inflicts on them even more brutal and entertaining. You won't find an amazing story or great acting, but this film does begin to start to nail down the formation of what was to become the most legendary horror villain ever. And although Jason Voorhees has been an ever-evolving entity from film to film, his foundation for the series I think was set with this film. If you go into this movie without high expectations, I think you will wind up with a decent if typical slasher. And at this time when slashers were being rushed to the screens to make a quick buck, Friday the 13th Part 3 won't disappoint. This next film takes us out of Friday the 13th Purgatory and into what I think the top 4 movies are in this franchise, starting with the very first one, released in 1980. Released as a direct result of the popularity of Halloween released 2 years prior, this horror film stunned audiences in much the same way, and did to summer camps what Halloween did to babysitting. One of the main reasons this film works so well in the slasher genre is that a then relatively unknown special effects artist named Tom Savini did the effects, and brought it to a whole new level. The kills in this movie, for the time, were some of the most savage yet believable ever put out to a bloodthirsty audience only all too willing to savor every last drop of it. And though admittedly Jason is only used as a plot device in this film, as Pamela, his mother, is the one butchering the innocent teens this time, this doesn't bother me as much as in A New Beginning, since the concept of Jason which was to become more than likely wasn't even a conceivable thought at this point. This film set the path for films such as Madman, Cheerleader Camp, and even contemporary films like The Ranger and Wrong Turn. There is a great deal owed to this film, and it deserves all of it. But with that said, in my opinion, there are still 3 better films that this series has released even over this first one. Deciding which film was going to be at the number 3 spot was extremely difficult, and I went back and forth several times before eventually settling on Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. It's pretty rare to have such a late sequel as a Part 7 be so high on a franchise ranking list. Most of the time, the longer the franchises continue, the worse the films become. But I really do enjoy The New Blood a lot. One of the reasons is that it gave the final girl, Tina, a unique ability to fight Jason, as she was telepathic when distressed. And I thought that was a pretty solid addition and made the confrontation between Tina and Jason interesting and one of the better final battles the franchise has. But the overriding factor of this movie, and the one that gave me the most fits over the placing of this one, is Kane Hodder. This is the first film in which he put on the hockey mask and wielded the machete, but not the last, as what he brought to this already established villain is pretty remarkable. He was able to bring Jason to the next level of evil, doing simple little things like the now famous chest breathing, and also the way he made Jason fast and powerful, smashing through anything in order to kill. Even though Kane Hodder did portray Jason Voorhees for the next 3 films, this is by far my favorite Jason of the entire franchise, and is the main reason why Part 7 is so high on this list. This next movie just edged out Part 7, and that is Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. I can and have watched this movie over and over again, and will probably never get sick of it. This is the last film of the series to feature Tommy Jarvis, who is, if any exist, Jason's main nemesis in the franchise. But there are a few reasons that make Part 6 one of my all-time favorite Friday the 13th movies. One is the tongue-in-cheek humor that this film has, even at times being almost a satire of slashers. It definitely has an element of gallows humor, which I always enjoy in a horror film. I also think that this movie, as a whole, has some of the best kills in the franchise. The death of Paula in particular, while off screen, when she gets ripped back into the cabin by Jason, I found brilliant, as it lets you know that something terrible is happening, but leaves the rest up to the imagination of the viewer. The main reason, however, that this movie stands out to me is the camp of this movie has children present while Jason goes on his rampage. Not the first to include children in the films, this is the first to include random children who weren't main or secondary characters, and it left them as vulnerable as anyone else in the film. This leads to an increase in tension, as it begs the questions: how evil is Jason? Will he kill an innocent child? If so, can the counselors or authority figures protect them? I feel this layer added so much not only to the stress of the situation, but for the first time made you root for Jason not to kill. While perhaps an unpopular pick at number 2, for me only one film can top it. If you have been paying attention, you can use the process of elimination to figure out what my number 1 is, which is Part 4, the final chapter. This was the first, but obviously not the last, of the films that was intended to end the franchise entirely. And if they did indeed stop making them, this would have been a more than sufficient conclusion to the Camp Crystal Lake saga. This movie also brought back Tom Savini, the special effects genius from the first film. This was a good move, as his work was once again awesome. Part 4 also has some of the more likable and memorable characters in the franchise, including the introduction of young Tommy Jarvis, but also best friends Ted and Jimmy, who subtly stole the show. Believe it or not, this film has the best dance scene in horror movie history, with Jimmy laying down moves that Michael Jackson would be jealous of. His character is without a doubt my favorite of the entire franchise, and even though I am a huge Crispin Glover fan, I can assure you that this has nothing to do with it. This film also has one of the most perplexing, strange, yet powerful lines ever yelled in a horror movie. Narrating your own murder has got to be one of the most brutal things that anyone can ever do. This is darkly hilarious, and a line I always look forward to when I watch this film. Aside from those, this film builds up nicely to a very satisfying intended series finale, which is easier said than done. Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter, includes and executes all of the things needed to make a quality slasher very well, maybe even exceptionally. The Friday the 13th franchise has had its ups and downs. Panned by critics, but lauded by fans, this franchise is much like its unstoppable villain in that it will never die. So guys, that's the list of my top 10 Friday the 13th films, and I encourage you to leave your top 10 list for this franchise, and any comments or criticism on mine down in the comments below. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again right here on Hyde's Horror. Thanks for watching, guys.
Hey Ted, where's that corkscrew, that fancy corkscrew for the wine bottle? Ted?